Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton in Waynesville, North Carolina. You can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. And today is Thursday, March 19th, 2020. Later today, the sun will ingress Aries. This is when the sun crosses the celestial equator in an upward fashion. We might call it the north node of the sun. That's what the vernal point is. It's the place where the sun enters into northern declinations. And normally this is a joyous time, but we have some very worrisome things to talk about. Unfortunately, I've been doing this for quite a long time, and I have a lot of tools to bring to bear on it. And I've done some research over the last few days, and so hopefully we'll be able to wrap our heads around it a little bit more. I don't think anybody really knows what's going on quite yet, and I'm not claiming that knowledge. But I'm just another person like you struggling to understand what the heck is going on, and just sharing my process in that in hopes that it can be educational for people. I think it's really important to remember before we get started, because we're going to talk about some, trigger alert. We're going to talk about some very challenging subjects such as death and mortality. And viruses, plagues, whatever you want, pandemics, whatever you want to, words you want to use. Two things, I think. There is reason for hopefulness. I don't think this is going to be as bad as some historical precedents that we're going to look at, and I'll show you why I don't think that. And another thing is to remember that it's always at the time of the greatest darkness that the heroine rises. She finds within herself her true glory. So remember that, because I got to tell you, I've been going through it myself on a personal level, and I was holed up before this thing even really began to be a thing, where we were advised to hole up and stuff, and that's something that I've gone through my whole life. Anyways, it was funny. I was looking at a friend post the other day on Facebook, and she was saying something about, welcome to life with PTSD. I spend half my life holed up, and finally it makes sense. And it's like, I know the feeling, right? Because, with strong introverts in general, whether or not you suffer from any kind of, condition, strong introverts in general know the feeling of, man, too much. I need to get, find my safe space, and I'm sure everybody knows that feeling, but I've just been really going through it on a personal level. And honestly, I don't even really feel like talking to anybody about anything, but here we are. And if I'm going to try to make sense of this for myself, I might as well share it with people, and maybe it'll be helpful. Another thing that I want people to remember, and I've been sharing some of the wonderful reviews that have been coming in of the podcast in an effort just to, get the word out there for people. There's a lot of new people coming into the field, which is wonderful. It's glorious. In fact, one of the other things that I see people saying about this situation is that, well, hey, remember, different historical examples, I think it was Newton who, got sequestered. He was sent away from school for a semester because of a plague. and came up with some of his greatest theories with calculus and so forth. For instance, Shakespeare wrote King Lear during a similar situation. You know, the 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 Renaissance was largely possible because of the Black Plague, um, as crazy as that may be. And so, you know, there's humanity always rebounds from, and that part of the mythos where the heroine finds that true glory inside of herself in the darkest moment, that is true. I believe in that. I really do. If I didn't believe in that, I wouldn't bother doing all this that I do. I wouldn't. Why bother? You know? So, and in that spirit, I want to share with you just a comment that somebody was trying to cheer me up. And she said, and I think this is true for everybody. That's why I'm sharing it. I'm not sort of patting my own back, but I'm saying I think this is something that we can all tune into and remember about ourselves as human beings. We all have this potential. She said, never forget what a bright light and inspiration you are. You've been one of the sparks that has lit many growing soul flames. Very Chiron of you, in parentheses. We're going to talk about Chiron here in a minute. It's probably the time we have all been waiting for to shine bright. See what I'm saying? I think you should bask in the glow of what you have helped to kindle. And that just brought tears to my eyes because, of course, that's every teacher's wish. That's why teachers teach. They want to spread that flame of the joy of knowledge. And here's the thing, y'all. We don't have to wait for this to get to pass over in order for the Renaissance to come, because the Renaissance is here. There's been an unparalleled explosion in astrology and the esoteric arts in general. And it's because of people like my friend, Kelly Lee Phipps, Celestial Renaissance. He wrote this in 1997. He knew this was coming. And it's because of people who have paved the way for generations that we are now in a position that we have unprecedented esoteric awareness to bring to bear on situations like these. The amount of astrological knowledge that has been unearthed from the classical era in the last 20 years or so is just unbelievable. And it's some of that knowledge that I've been very privileged and very fortunate to be exposed to, that I want to share with you today and bring to bear on this situation. Excuse me. So, one of the things that I have talked about on my personal Facebook page, I took the time to look at the last eclipse, because it was shortly after the last eclipse, which was an annular eclipse where you can see the sun's corona, by the way. I've seen some young astrologers rightfully note that and thinking, yeah, way to go. I think it was Catherine Urban up in Cleveland. I follow her a lot. She's one of the bright young stars that I really enjoy following. But yeah, you know, it seems like that eclipse had something to do with it. And what I did is I cast the eclipse chart for various capital cities to see, you know, and the situation in Wuhan looks pretty scary. Of course, it's the epicenter of this thing, but the situation for Beijing was a bit different. And so then I compared that to the situation in DC, and it seems to show that this thing can and will be contained. That we're not going to have a situation like the 1918 pandemic, which was extremely dire. I don't see that, first of all. And yet, there are some parallels to 1918, and indeed, there's some parallels to 1345, which is kind of scary, and I think speaks to the reality that we do need to take this situation seriously. So, without further ado, let me well, I can just introduce the basics of it. So the other day I was thinking about, you know, my personal situation, and I was thinking about, um, well, yeah, of course your life is upside down because, you know, you're nearing your 52nd birthday, and a lot of people don't know this, but 52 years in Mayan astrology is the turning point of all turning points. They have a cycle. The only one we have in Western astrology is Chiron. Um, but 13 days shy of your 52nd Gregorian birthday, there's a time when all the wheels of the Mayan calendar match up to the day you were born, and it's called the new fire birthday. And I was thinking, yeah, you know, okay, so makes sense anyways, even if you're going through it. And and then I started thinking about Chiron. You know, Chiron ingressed Aries, and 1968 was a crazy year, y'all. I mean, there was major unrest all over the world, just like there is now, in a very different way, obviously. But then I started realizing, you know, and Chiron was crossing the vernal point of Aries, right? At that time. We didn't even know about it yet. It wasn't discovered until it got to Taurus in the 70s. And yet, that's what was going on. And what we have right now is Chiron is at the vernal point again, but the nodes are at the solstices, right? So 3 out of 4 of the 4 main points on the wheel of the year, right, the solstices and equinoxes, are occupied by slow moving bodies, points, etc. And I think that's very interesting because when we look, the only parallel there is to 1918 is that same thing was going on. So let me share my screen here and I'll show you. And again, I'm not saying this is going to be as bad as 1918, but it is really the only pandemic we've had since then that has spread as wide as that one. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Pull up my chart program. So this is the chart for later today, cast in Washington, D.C., the capital of the country where I reside. And you'll see that, you know, the sun is entering Aries down here, and there's Chiron at 5 degrees of Aries, so near the vernal point. And the south node is at the winter solstice, north node at the summer solstice. Okay, now, if we go back to 1968, that's not the case. In fact, let's just do that. Let's go back. So we can see that, yes, in 1968, the sun was conjunct Chiron very closely at the vernal equinox. But the nodes were already well into the cardinal signs by then. They weren't at the solstices or the equinoxes at that time. So a little bit different situation. But if we go back to 1918, what's very interesting is that we see the same situation we have this year repeat. And that is Chiron is at the vernal point and the nodes are at the solstices. So in 1918, here we have Pisces rising, the sun's in Aries, conjunct Chiron very closely, right? And then notice here's the south node at the summer solstice. So they're flipped. but you have the same basic conditions you have this year. Chiron at the vernal point, the nodes at the solstices. So there is a parallel here. Now, notice, now the other thing that I was talking about with respect to why I think this situation is going to be more contained, notice that the ruler of the ascendant, Jupiter, is in its detriment. So it's in a sign opposite its rulership, which usually signifies trouble, troublesome or difficult situations. Not always bad. They can be good sometimes. Sometimes they can be bad. Jupiter happens to be in a decan that he rules, but Jupiter is 3 minutes shy of being in the bounds that he rules of Gemini. Jupiter, Egyptian bounds that I'm using, Jupiter rules from 6 degrees up to 12 degrees of Gemini. Now, Jupiter is also in an angular house in the 4th house. So, and Jupiter is the planet of, like, expansion, right? So this is definitely a worrisome situation here, because you have a planet of expansion ruling the ascendant, and the 6th house of health has Saturn, the greater malefic, and this is and Saturn is the malefic, the out of sect malefic. What that means is Saturn is the malefic that is in disagreement with the nature of the chart. Saturn is better off in a diurnal chart because he's so cold. Warming him up helps. In fact, I was just reading an article yesterday by my publisher, Aaron Cheek. Well, the article, he posted an article on his Facebook that was talking about, like, fresh air and sunshine is an actual therapy was an actual therapy that was used for the Spanish flu, and it worked. And since then, it's been proven to work, So, so yeah, that's one of the things, is that when you confine people inside, and that's not necessarily a good situation for healing. So this is a nighttime chart. Saturn is the malefic that is not so great in nighttime, because Saturn's already cold. Nighttime is cool. And so Saturn is the troublemaker in this chart, and Saturn is in the 6th house of health, conjunct Neptune. Not a pretty picture. Another thing that's really interesting about this, Ariel Gutman wrote a blog for the Mountain Astrologer where she brought in the asteroid Hygeia. And I think I saw Adam Summer was talking about this too, where he said something about Hygeia in there. And I had a guest on the podcast many times, my really good friend James Rogers, who is an MD. And he used to work with Hygeia, and he said that Chiron represents illness, healing from illness, like actual, when dis-ease, like when things have gone wrong. Chiron represents the state of recovering from that place of Hygeia. He said represents the maintenance of health, right? Hygiene. Good hygiene is the foundation of good health. And so it was interesting to see those astrologers bring Hygeia in. And one of the things that Ariel noted was that at the time of the first report, the people in Wuhan, sent a report to the World Health Organization saying, we got a strange situation going on here with a lot of people getting some weird kind of pneumonia, and it's a little bit worrisome. And maybe y'all should be on the lookout for something here. And she noted that in that chart, Mars, Hygeia was opposite Mars, and Mars is the planet of pestilences. He just is. And you'll notice in this chart, see how the numbers are red in this program. That means the planet is retrograde. Mars is widely opposite the sun, and that means Mars is very bright, very fiery red, big red Mars in the sky at this time. And guess what? We were at war. There was a world war going on. And why is Mars associated with pestilences? Well, very often wars are where either the cause of the disease itself, rotting bodies and so forth, or poor sanitation in the camps and so forth, or poor sanitation from people that have been displaced and so on, refugees and whatnot, or the situation is just spread by the armies moving all over the place, right? Which probably, not probably, there certainly was the case that having a world war on definitely helped spread the thing, right? Talk about social distancing. I mean, you're in a ditch with 100 other guys, waiting to hear the whistle to go over in the no man's land. I mean, that's just like a breeding ground for disease. And so here you see a very clear picture of that with Hygeia in the first house, opposite Mars in the seventh. Mars is very bright. Mars is actually, curiously enough, just within his bounds. Each of the planets has, each of the 5 visible planets has a section of each sign that they rule, and these are called bounds. And Demetra George does a really good job of delineating this. For modern astrologers, most of them, all they know about rulership is, that the signs have rulership. Some of them use exaltations, and some of them use, outer planets for rulers, which is, I don't even want to get into that. It's a whole other situation. It's not a situation that is in accord with the original way rulerships were thought of. But Demetra George's book, Ancient Astrology, Volume 1, she does a really good job of talking about how these different kinds of dignities that within the original system, in the medieval times, they just kind of said, well, domicile dignity, rulership by sign is worth 5 points, and exaltation is worth 4, and so on. And there was some analogies of like bounds dignity, for instance. The analogy was that the teacher in the classroom gets to make up the rules for the classroom, but the principal gets to make up the rules for the entire school, right? So there's some dignity in being able to localize the conditions towards something that works for you. And Demetra George talks about how bounds dignity is the power of autonomy to set one's own rules of engagements and not be subject to another's authority. Now think about that. What is, we hear about these orders, shelter in place. What is that? It's boundaries. It's setting the terms of engagement. Like, we're not going to engage the way we usually do at all. We're going to have a very different set of terms of engagement. You see, these are also called terms. Bounds are terms. So there is some possibility for containment here. Mars is in its own bounds, but it's in retrograde motion, and it's about to leave its bounds. So, and the ruler of the 6th house is the sun, which is normally you would think, oh, that's good, a planet in its exaltation, but check it out. Mars is the ruler, both by domicile and by face of the sun. So, there again, you have this situation. I might have to stop here for a second, just briefly. Okay, so let's get back to it here. So yeah, this chart is pretty darn worrisome. And what's interesting about it is that just you know, as I said, when I first started trying to track this thing to understand it, I was looking at the previous eclipse, which was an annular eclipse that was near the solstice. And those are always very powerful. Um, and if we look at the previous eclipse to this one, what we see is that there was also an annular solar eclipse. Um, it was further from the node. It was probably very early in the series. What happens is eclipses start out really far from the nodes, and they happen like at the, if it's a, this is a north node eclipse, so it happens, the first eclipse happens at the North Pole. And then they gradually wind their way around the Earth until they wind up at the South Pole. And in the middle, they're right on the equator, and they're very strong. They're either total eclipses or annular eclipses. This one is an annular eclipse, but see how it's about 10 degrees from the North Node? That means it's early in the part of when it starts to become annular. There's a band in the middle. So this one is probably like, yeah, halfway down from the North Pole towards the equator, and then it's later they're going to get more. So this is not a super powerful eclipse, but the eclipse, the lunar eclipse that followed it, was a blood moon, total eclipse. You can see there that there's only 5 degrees separating, and it's conjunct Pluto. So, and it's conjunct the solstice point. So that's definitely a difficult looking eclipse. And you know, in the U.S., of course, it's in the 8th house, which is the house of death, amongst other things. Yeah, and here you have again the ruler of the ascendant is Jupiter. And Jupiter's in its detriment, retrograde. It's angular. And what does Jupiter do? It spreads things, you know. So, and Jupiter, you know, yeah. So now, let's go back to the current time and compare. So one of the things about this Aries ingress is that the ruler of the ascendant is Mars, and Mars is the planet of pestilences now, and Mars is conjunct Jupiter. So that is not exactly a pretty picture. The sun is in the 6th house, and the sun is in its dignity. So that's something. Chiron is there as well, and then there's of course that square with the nodes. One thing about this grouping being in the 3rd house, the 3rd house is a cadent house, and generally speaking, cadent houses, because they're moving away from the angle, the cadent house follows the angle. So it's generally, cadent houses are thought to move things away from the native. In this case, the native would be the United States. And so generally speaking, you want the malefics in cadent houses because that signifies the troubles away from you. And so there's that. Mars ruling the ascendant is not ideal. Mars is exalted here, and conjunct the greater benefic, you know, which normally would be a hopeful sign, but you know, in this case, Jupiter's, you know, in its fall, so not so great. But again, I don't think it's quite the situation where you had, you know, Jupiter ruling the ascendant, an undignified planet, and its you know, detriment, ruling the ascendant, is, I think, worse. So, and in this chart also, let's see. The other thing the other couple things that are somewhat worrisome about this chart is that it's a fixed sign on rising, and you know, according to the dogma going all the way back to, you know, Abu Masar and Masha Allah, the Persian astrologers of the Middle Ages, and cats like them, if it's a fixed sign, the chart's good for the entire year. If it's a mutable sign, you would draw the next ingress chart in Libra, so it would be good for half the year. If it's a cardinal sign, you would draw all 4 cardinal ingress charts for that year. Because fixed signs, you know, are fixed. Mutable signs are you know, kind of in between cardinal and fixed. And cardinal signs are very active, very forceful. They're not known for their stamina. Actually, they're not known for their follow through. Capricorn a little bit more because it's Earth, right? So this is the picture for the entire year, and it's not exactly a pretty picture. What's really sort of, you might say interesting, you might say scary about this chart is that it was actually the conjunction of Mars with Jupiter and Saturn in the 1345 ingress chart that astrologers blamed for the Black Death. Now that was in Aquarius. And of course, at the time, they thought that the disease spread through the air. That's why it had all those masks and everything. In fact, we know that's not exactly the case. It spreads through touch, right? So really, rather than a mask, or in addition to a mask, you know, you want gloves on so that you don't pick up the virus from various surfaces. So the fact that this is in an Earth sign, it's not the same as 1345, so maybe that's a good thing. But if you think about that, it's actually spread through touch, and Earth is like that. Maybe not so good. I think really this speaks to Capricorn is the sign of, you know, the government, the state. And really, I think that this speaks to the financial and the socio-political ramifications of this thing being really shaking things up and making people understand, you know, over in Singapore and South Korea and stuff, they had a much better response because they've been through this before. Whereas in places who hadn't, they weren't necessarily prepared. And so the the shakeup to the prevailing social order, I think, is going to be lasting. Now, that's probably a good thing because, by all accounts, the prevailing order is not working. You know, it's simply not working. Not really for anybody, and for people who are, you know, minorities and or you know, suffer in other ways. It's just it's really bad. And so I think actually the fact that this one's happening in Capricorn, the one in 1345 was in Aquarius, and of course air signs are, the symbol for air is an upward pointing triangle, up and out. So I think also that one spread a lot more because of it happening in an air sign, whereas earth signs are down and in. And I think, you know, the fact that it's happening in an earth sign does suggest more containment. And for the US in particular, I do think with it being in a cadent house, that is a hopeful sign that it's probably not going to be as bad here as other places. When I first started looking at the eclipse charts do show some hopefulness in terms of containment. So if we go back to the previous, now this eclipse on January 10th, that was not a blood moon, I don't believe. Let me just check my facts on that. You know, it's about 12 degrees from the nodes. That's usually not a total eclipse. Let me just check myself on that. Yeah, that's an pulse eclipse. Very different animal, not nearly as strong. We did have an annular solar eclipse before that on the solstice point. So here's another difference. The 1918 chart was preceded by a blood moon. Now the moon in a mundane chart means the people. The sun is the rulers. So in the sense that the more powerful eclipse preceding this was a solar eclipse, it suggests that it's actually more worrisome and troublesome for the ruling class in the end than the people. And also, this was the one that was conjunct the vernal point, and it's conjunct Jupiter. So there you have the spreading, you know, that we were talking about. Now, what's interesting here is that the ruler of the ascendant is the domicile ruler of the ascendant is Venus. Now, Venus is in the 5th house, which is her joy, actually. Venus joys in the creative arts, which is one of the things that are getting shut down. But what's interesting about that is Venus is in her bounds. She has the power of autonomy and establishing the terms of engagement here. Venus is also in her own decan. So Venus is not without dignity here, and that is a good sign. Because remember, in 1918, we had the opposite. We had a planet opposite its dignity. That's a good sign. And we had the same thing going on in China. And if you know, in China right now, the cases are already going down. There's more people recovered. So if our curve follows the same curve as China, you know, we should be out of this in a couple, you know, months or so. The fact that there's a fixed sign on the vernal ingress chart suggests that maybe that's not the end of it. You know, in 1918, the worst part of that epidemic or pandemic was the wave that happened in the summer. So it's possible that there will be more waves and more, you know, containment exercises that we all have to go back into Chiron's cave, so to speak. But overall, I think the fact that this eclipse, that the ruler of the ascendant is you know, in its own bounds, that's very hopeful. Notice here's what Ariel was talking about. Here you have Mars is opposite Hygeia, and Hygeia is on the star Algol. Now, this is very interesting, and this is also, I think, a really good teaching moment for a few reasons, because you notice that I've been talking about, you know, planets in their, you know, opposite their dignities being, you know, not so good. Please, all of you out there who might have, and I have a couple of them myself who have planets opposite, doesn't mean you're not a good person, okay? I'm not saying that. It's very important to understand that mundane astrology operates by a very different set of parameters than natal astrology, okay? In mundane astrology, you know, the world situation is what it is, and we as individuals are basically subject to that. It's imposed on us in a way that we often have very little control over. Notice I'm saying very little. We do have some power, especially in a spiritual sense, and how we react to it. I'm not suggesting a victim stance. I'm just saying that you know, in a mundane chart, you can use the dignities and saying, oh, this is a bad looking situation because it's a situation that's out there. It just is. It's not a person that we're talking about. When we're talking about people, I think we need to talk about the dignities very differently. I wouldn't suggest that a person with a planet opposite its dignity is a bad person. In fact, you know, Johnny Cash is one of the examples that I often use. I gave a talk about this at Great Lakes Astrology Conference last year. You know, Venus in Aries is the Almuten of his chart, and there's this wonderful picture of Johnny Cash doing this. He took out an ad in Billboard magazine saying, "Thank you to the Nashville music establishment for all your support." Not right. um, very Venus in Aries. It's opposite her sign of dignity in Libra. But does that mean he was a bad artist? No, he was a great artist. It just meant that his art tended to fly in the face of convention. He made an album in prison, and everybody told him it couldn't be done, it wouldn't sell, and it was one of the best albums ever. You know, so so please get that message that, you know, don't take personally any of this stuff. Um, and on that note, it's interesting, you know, Ariel mentioned also that Hygeia was conjunct Algol. The now Algol has two kinds of reputation. In a mundane chart, absolutely terrifyingly malefic. In fact, you know, my sister's a nurse, and I was talking to her the other day, and she said when she was leaving the hospital, you know, the guards were there, and they had their sidearms, and she was like, "Oh boy," you know. And she talked to one of them, and he said, "Yeah," he said, "it's really not my call, but you know, this is what this is." And she said, "You know, it seemed kind of like it felt kind of like 9/11." Well, what's interesting about that is that if you do the vernal ingress chart for 2001 in New York City, you'll see Saturn conjunct Algol rising. So absolutely, in a mundane chart, Algol can be very malefic and very worrisome. And here you have Hygeia conjunct Algol. Now remember, that doesn't mean that Algol is necessarily bad in a natal chart, although it can definitely point to situations that people have had to go through a lot of trauma. But in magical use, Algol is what's known as is the apotropaic symbol par excellence. Apotropaic meaning protective. So it's basically it's just like if Algol is staring at you, if Medusa was staring at you, you're going to get turned into stone. But when Perseus managed to take that energy and turn it around, he was now wielding that energy. He was saying, anybody that messes with me, you know, the Kraken, for instance, I'll turn you to stone. And Andromeda's, you know, uncle didn't like them two getting together. Yeah, you get turned to stone too, you know. And so it's about the direction that in a mundane chart, the energy is coming at you, and there's only so much you can do about it. But when you're using that star in a magical sense, you're taking that energy respectfully and prayerfully and with reverence, asking it to be, asking for permission to wield that energy and say, protect me. You're putting it on your shield, and the energy is radiating out from you. You see? Totally different situation. So, and in fact, there's some really, and here's the thing, think about this. Let's just say that Algol is like, we're going to blame Algol, like, you know, I mean, that, you know, how that trip always works, blame the woman. And, but let's just say that we're going to say, you know, that this signature is part of the, you know, the whole pandemic thing. Well, guess what? When they create a vaccine for this, they're going to take a little bit of that, you know, of that poison, of that virus, and stick it in you. So the very thing that is the poison can also be the cure. You see, the cure is in the dose, as Paracelsus was fond of saying. You know, even water. If you drink, you know, 2 gallons of water all in a one, you know, that's not going to be a good situation, because it's going to thin your blood out drastically, and it could be, even water can end up being a poison. Good water, clean water. So yeah, so you know, the Algol could very well be part of the cure here, and there's a couple really good elections coming up for Algol. I've got my algal talisman on right now, um, one that I made last year, and I'm going to be making some for people. I've got some rough cut diamonds to go in there, and some mugwort, and I'm going to be consecrating those later on the 28th. I'll talk about that a little bit more for people who want to maybe, invoke some protection for themselves. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do that, because I'm sure people are wanting some kind of practical tool that they can use to get some kind of feeling of security amidst all this chaos. So what you want to do is, I mean, the very first thing you can do is, and I would say 4 times a day, but certainly 2 times a day. In his book, Christopher Warnock says, the quick and easy method for either with petition, i.e., prayer, or like a quick, paper talisman. And I'll just put the symbol for algal here. This is like a Kabbalistic glyph or sigil that it goes with algal since the Middle Ages. You can draw this on a piece of paper at the right time and say a prayer to Medusa, and that will put you in her cult, as we were talking about last time. So if you want to be part of the cult of Medusa, and become one of her followers, I think she is definitely available for some serious protection at this time. So what you want to do, algal is located at 26 degrees Taurus, 26 minutes. So you just want to put algal on the ascendant or on the midheaven. I would say that it works with the descendant and the IC as well. In fact, if you wanted to protect your home, it might be better for the IC, whereas if you just wanted to protect your person, it might be better on the ascendant. If you wanted to protect your community, it might be better on the midheaven. See what I'm saying? Protect your spouse or partner or friends on the 7th. You see what I'm saying? But yeah, if we just, so you have to change this time for your location, but you just move the time until you get 26 degrees, 26 minutes of Taurus rising. Whoa, there we go. Today it was at 9:48 a.m. and 33 seconds in Washington, D.C., when algal was rising. And then you can do the same thing with the midheaven. And what's interesting is that now that would just be for, like I said, a quick and easy one. That would be, and the duration of that would be relatively short. The duration of its effectiveness would be relatively short, because you don't have the star needs to be anchored into the physical plane somehow, and usually that's accomplished by way of the moon, because the moon is the planet closest to the earth that helps to materialize that energy. So the next opportunity for an election like that is on Monday, when algal is rising. The moon will be sextile to algal, so that sextile is helpful in grounding that energy and bringing it into form. So it looks like that'll be about somewhere around 9:30 Eastern time. You see, you have the sextile from 24. The moon is applying to a sextile, and Venus is applying to a conjunction. Now, usually I only share these elections with my members, but being as how the situation is what it is, I'm going to be making talismans on the following Saturday, when the moon is conjunct Venus and Algol as Algol is rising. And so, and now this chart is extremely powerful in my estimation, because what you have is a lot of dignity. You have several planets in their domicile or exaltation. So it's about, in Washington, it's about 9 minutes after 9 a.m. And again, you have to adjust this for your location. Well, it's about 10 after 9, 11, 12. Yeah, about 9:12 a.m. in Washington. And see, you've got a planet conjunct the star, a planet of a similar nature to the star too, because remember, Medusa was once a gorgeous maiden, and then she had this encounter with Poseidon. Some say she was raped, some say they had a tryst and offended Athena. You know, obviously, you know, there's a lot of patriarchal stuff there going on. But I think that Venus, in her dignity of Taurus, and the moon in her exaltation, Venus has domicile dignity, which gives the power of resources. The moon gives the power of exaltation, which is honors and esteem. The sun is exalted in this chart. Saturn is in its domicile. Mars is exalted in this chart. There's a lot of, and again, in this chart, now from a mundane perspective, Mars applying to Saturn is not a pretty picture. I would not necessarily put that in a talisman if I were, if this were just a Venus talisman, for instance. Venus is attractive. I wouldn't want to attract that energy towards me. But this, remember, this is a shield. This is you're bumping off whatever's coming at you with this energy. And so that Mars Saturn energy is put, and indeed Algol is said to be of the nature of Mars and Saturn. That is aggressive, right? That's what you want in a protector. So that Mars Saturn, you know, being high in the sky, I think is absolutely appropriate for a protective talisman. And again, you can what I do is I found these for like $5. If you go to Michael's, there's these diamond tipped, what they are is they're button reamers or bead reamers. Is like to ream out the hole in a button or a bead. But you can use them as engraving tools, and they're like $5. And by the way, Algol loves diamond, so there you go. And you can scratch this symbol into a piece of copper or brass, which, by the way, copper and brass, which is an alloy of copper, kills viruses. So there you go. So I think this is like, it's amazing how like the cure is found within the problem, you know, like, or by turning the problem around, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but I think you get what I mean. In other words, you know, Hygeia with Algol represented our awareness of the problem at any rate. And now with Algol receiving the benefit, Venus, I think we can turn that around into our own kind of vaccine, if you will, or sort of magical vaccine. And then the idea is to very reverently appeal to Medusa, Algol, and ask for her favor and her protection. And you're literally calling that energy down with one hand and pointing towards the object with the other. So you're literally channeling that energy, and you're passing the object through the incense. And I would use an incense that's known for protection. Frankincense is one that's often used. Anything that has sage, you know, anything that has a protective quality. And that's pretty much it. That's how you make a talisman. And so um, I would, and you know, use what you got. Obviously, if you're going to put yourself in danger to go out there and get, you know, if you've only got paper, just use the best paper you got, and you know, and do with what you have. And it'll be a lot better than nothing. You know what I'm saying? So with any luck, with a little bit of magical intervention or magical, uh, you know, medicine, and with good, proper social distancing, you know, we can flatten the curve, and this wave, this first wave, you know, will pass by in another couple weeks, maybe a month, and if there are subsequent waves, you know, hopefully they'll be less and less, and and we can all come out of this thing with um, possibilities for renewal, because my experience is that um, experiences like this, there's always, you know, it's like when you're grieving, you know, when you're in the grief, you know, everything looks so um, bleak, and you know, you're just really hurting. But eventually you come out of it and you start living your life again, and then almost invariably there's like this something good happens or restores your faith in life, and you know, and and you know, it's like you wind up someplace you couldn't have been without that happening. There's a lot of people who say that. There's a lot of people, you know, in my book I talk about you know, the Mercury elemental year as a series of developmental phases, and the final developmental phase that happens around 79 years. A lot, you know, um, I was talking about, I think it was Schopenhauer was saying that, you know, he looks back on his life and things that seemed, you know, sort of disjunct and chaotic at the time, he sees how they were part of a beautiful plan, almost like his life was a symphony. And he just didn't know that the movement was changing or whatever, you know? Um, so yeah, with any luck, you know, we'll look back on that before this year's done and say that, and find ourselves in a place that is a good place and some place that we may not have been without this. Um, you know, it's interesting in terms of the astrology, you know, Jupiter, Saturn happening in Aquarius. Jupiter, Saturn, of course, was always one of the main mundane charts for, you know, thousand or more years. And another chart that they would do was Mars, Saturn. And what's interesting is we have to have the Mars Saturn conjunction in Aquarius in the same place in the early degrees of Aquarius before we get the Jupiter. So it's almost like the malefic's got to come through there and like clear the way before Jupiter Saturn can come in and establish something new, because it's, you know, um, it's like the attachments to the old way of doing things have to be like, you know, taken away. You're not going to do that anymore, you know, in order for something new to really be a viable option. Um, and so, yeah, hopefully that doesn't scare people too much. Hopefully it has enough sobriety um, to get everyone on board with the proper social distancing that's going to keep them and their loved ones and all of us safe. Um, but at the same time, reminds you of your power and and faith, um, and kindle that, keep that little flame alive in your heart during this dark time, because it will it will absolutely result in something new and beautiful on the other side. I'm quite sure of it. So with that said, happy spring, damn it. It's going to be one way or another. We have to make it so. All right, lots of love and blessings of Algol, Medusa, beautiful priestess, powerful woman, powerful goddess. Please Grant us your protection during these dark times and teach us to make medicine out of this darkness. Aho, thank you. See you next time, y'all.